Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. This is the 8th episode of the Lyceum Round-Table. Today we are going to discuss the Tory upset election of Boris Johnson in the United Kingdom, which in many ways has certain affinities to the Donald Trump upset 3 years ago in the United States. So from across the pond, we'll throw it over to you, Swithun. Why is so what's the big deal about the Tory victory and why is it an upset?
Well, it's a bit of an upset because whilst the pollsters were thinking there would be a sort of a Tory win, maybe a 30 seat, something like that, possibly as high as 50, nobody predicted the 78 seat win. This is the biggest Tory majority since 1987, which is the Thatcher's third election, which he won. And it also happens to be the Labour Party's worst performance in an election in total number of seats since 1935. They lost nearly, let me double check, they lost nearly 8% of their vote share relative to 2017. So just for everybody who may not know how the system works, it's essentially a situation where there are 650 MPs in different areas, so a bit like senatorial elections, except the guy who becomes prime minister is the leader of the party who gets the most effective, like senators, over these 650 districts. And the Tories, as I say, have won by a massive margin. I say the biggest since 1987. Interesting, their vote share only went up by 1.2%. So overall, their vote share wasn't go up by that much, but crucially, it went up in the important areas, which were traditional Labour strongholds in the Northeast and the Midlands, who previously would never vote Tory since probably Margaret Thatcher, because she was associated with the deindustrialization of Britain. So the industrial northern towns and the Midlands. And so these have flipped over for, in the case of Blythe near Newcastle, for the first time ever. It was created as a constituency for the first time in 1950. And ever since 1950 until a few days ago, it had been Labour. The areas that the Tories won were basically working class Brexiteer areas. These are the areas which were relatively poor, traditional Labour voters from the traditional sort of blue-collar working class, but have voted to leave the European Union. And the Labour Party had a very difficult job of trying to come with a coherent plan which would satisfy all their voting clientele. Similar to the Democrats in America, they have two major voting blocks. That is the traditional working class and the upper middle class metropolitan woke university types. And the latter were very, very pro-EU, whereas the former hated the organization, probably because of its association with immigration more than a lot of things. But they had these two groups to try and satisfy. And Corbyn basically satisfied neither of them with his bizarre policy, which was, I will renegotiate a good deal, a better one than Johnson, and then we're going to have a referendum on it, on which I am going to remain neutral. And then everybody else in the shadow cabinet said, we are going to campaign for Remain. So it kind of just sounded like, well, how on earth are you going to get a decent deal when you want to stay anyway, because you won't, which the sort of working class types like, that's stupid. And then a lot of the sort of really hardcore Remainers voted for people like Liberal Democrats who were neither liberal nor democratic and ran on the campaign of stop Brexit and cancel it in its entirety. So much so that their leader actually lost her seat in Scotland to the Scottish National Party, only by a few hundred votes, but that was highly amusing. So, yeah, this is unprecedented, at least since the 1980s. It's a great shift in where you pick up votes and where you pick up seats. Similar to Trump, Johnson did not go on the traditional sort of conservative since the 1980s policy of deregulation and tax cuts. It was all about spending more on the National Health Service, spending on infrastructure, but also at the same time signaling a soft sort of cultural nationalism of sorts, which tied into the Brexiteer voting base, which is unlike the Labour Party. I've mentioned their Brexit policy. Some of their economic policies were actually quite popular in their sort of traditional areas. They were advocating renationalisation of the utilities, the railways, big increases in taxation, very, very, very big increases in government spending, which, if you poll people, is actually a relatively popular policy. However, they mixed it in with suicidal wokeness, such as suggesting that they're going to have mandatory lessons in schools on the evils of the British Empire. Jeremy Corbyn once in the past mentioned that after work drinks were sexist because women had childcare requirements, and so this was exclusionary. And you have these odd types rising to the top in the Labour Party. And this, of course, tied in, which I think to some extent was unfair, his association with the IRA, Hezbollah, Hamas, etc., that made him look like he was, not very patriotic, and was very much against the Britain as a whole, as a country, and their sort of general, we consider anti sort of British policy that he would have. So that's really what Brexit and their sort of SJW inflected policy was what really sunk them. If you really want to win an election in the UK at present, you can advocate nationalisation of quite a few things, increase government spending, as long as you have relatively strong immigration controls and leave the European Union, and you do that, you probably win by an even bigger landslide than the Tories would. So that's the general situation, and that's probably the major causes of them.
All right. One aspect I think that Keith is qualified to discuss here is, much like the Democrats in the United States, New Labor, pretty much repudiated all of the classic labor positions of working class protection, the old labor that sort of, confronted Margaret Thatcher as she broke the unions. And then now it's more of this globalist, ecumenical, globalist, humanist elite, where back in the 90s, I guess you could say that the Democrats and Labor, you could, if you wanted to be charitable, you could say they didn't hate the UK and America. They just had a different vision for it. But over the past 25, 30 years, the rhetoric has crystallized into the fact that not only do they not like what UK and America currently are, they hate it. They hate what the United States and the United Kingdom always stood for and want to completely annihilate it. Now, Labor from like 1970 or 1980, or even Clement Attlee in 1945, probably didn't believe that. So Keith, why don't you explain a little bit the change in old Labor to new Labor?
Well, I think that the same thing that you're describing has happened in most Western countries in recent decades. I think we can look at domestic American politics as well as domestic British politics, and as well as the politics of France and Germany and Sweden and Australia and other countries that we commonly think of as the West, or at least the Western Europe and the Anglosphere. And we can see the same trajectory has happened, in the sense that the left, what was thought of as the left historically, which was the party of the working class, of labor unions, of the Social Democrats, and so forth, the left has undergone a transformation where it's no longer oriented towards the working class. I mean, it may still try to embrace the working class as one of its constituencies, or it may have to make concessions to the working class or throw some bones out for the working class. But it's not the bread and butter working class left that of the, say, the 1930s and 1940s and 1950s, or even more recently. Instead, as Swithun said, it's become increasingly a left that is an upper middle class left. It represents the professional class, this kind of urban cosmopolitan, nowadays they call it woke, but culturally left-wing sector that really views economic issues as a secondary matter because they're not the ones that are really hurting economically. And in fact, they may actually have somewhat more conservative economic views because they tend to be affluent. So increasingly, the left in the West has become the upper middle class left, which is oriented towards cultural leftism and upward mobility for relatively privileged sectors of traditional outgroups. You see that all the time in American politics. You see the Democrats represent the upwardly mobile racial minorities, the feminist professional women, the upwardly mobile sectors of the gay culture, also social issues, environmentalism and all these many other things that are not specifically class issues, or at least not working class issues. And that has had the effect of creating a split on the left in most countries, or at least most Western countries of the kind we're describing. What Swithun said about the division that existed among labor between the more upper middle class, professional class, urban, cosmopolitan, woke laborites, and the actual working class is the same exact split that we have in the United States. We saw that in 2016 in that election where we had Hillary Clinton, who really was the candidate of the woke upper middle class, basically saying, we don't need to change anything. Everything is fine. Let's just keep the status quo going. And this guy Trump over here, why do you want to vote for some scumbag like that? That was really her campaign. But it didn't fly, and the reason that it didn't fly is because it just didn't address a lot of things that the working class are interested in, whereas Donald Trump at least pretended to do so. Donald Trump talked about trade policy and unemployment in the Rust Belt and the economic impact of immigration, all these different things that allowed him to win certain states that are traditional Democratic strongholds, the Rust Belt states primarily. That's why Donald Trump won. He addressed these class issues in a way that Hillary Clinton could have cared less about. And it seems to me that, without being an expert on domestic British politics, it seems to me an almost identical scenario has played out in this particular election, where, from what I was following, Johnson's Conservatives positioned themselves, sincerely or not, as the party of pro-Brexit, which the majority of the British people voted for twice, I believe. I believe there were two referendums that each time the Brexit won. Correct me if I'm wrong. And so Johnson positioned the Tories as the party of Brexit, the party of the working class. He didn't run as a fiscal conservative, a neoliberal, a Thatcherite, a Reaganite. He didn't run as that. What he did run as is somebody that was more interested in working class issues, just as Donald Trump did. Donald Trump also abandoned a lot of the old Reaganite, neoliberal, Clintonite, neoliberal rhetoric. And then the Labour Party, the Corbyn's party, struck me, from what I was watching, as doing the same thing that some of the Democrats in this election cycle are trying to do, and that is keep one foot in the neoliberal camp and keep one foot in the Labour camp. I see Elizabeth Warren doing that here in the United States. Her thing is, well, you neoliberals can vote for me too, but because I've got, I'm with you on all this woke stuff, and all that. Although I do think, as Swithun said, Corbyn is further to the left on a lot of economic issues than most of our Democrats are. I think even Bernie Sanders is not quite as far left as Corbyn is. But I don't think that was his major liability, though. I don't think it was his major liability. I think the major liability that Corbyn had was he did not take a hardline pro-Brexit position. He was lukewarm or wishy-washy on that. Probably because, in part, probably because he didn't want to alienate the neoliberal sectors within labor, and also perhaps out of conviction. A lot of people from the far left don't care for Brexit because they don't like decentralization generally, or they associate it with xenophobia or something like that. As far as Corbyn's affiliation with the hard left or Hamas and groups like that aren't really hard left, but not by a rational definition of what left is, but because he was seen as being associated with what are perceived of as Islamist terrorist groups and things like that, and if he had any kind of association with the IRA in England, that would certainly be a potential liability. We had an issue like that some years ago when Barack Obama was running for president. He had been associated with William Ayers, who had been part of the Weather Underground in the 60s and 70s. So I think some of these things were probably a liability for Corbyn with the political right as well. But I ultimately, though, I think I would largely see the election as a referendum on Brexit to a large degree. Which party was the pro-Brexit party, and by extension, which one was the working class party? And because the working class was certainly the most sympathetic to Brexit, that's why the Conservatives won.
Yeah, Swithun, you had a comment you wanted to make?
Oh, just a couple of clarifications. There was only one EU referendum, but following that, there was the 2017 general election, in which both the Tories and the Labour Party ran on leaving, and as a combination won by a massive majority. You then had, when it all got cocked up and we're supposed to leave and we weren't this year, we took part of the European elections in, I think it was June, and then the Brexit Party, which had formed from the ruin of UKIP, which is still going, won by a massive margin as the single largest party, and the Tories didn't do very well at all. And then they got this one as well. So basically, in all the sort of votes that have taken place subsequently, it has been sort of primarily pro-Brexit, I would say, was the way I would analyse them, at least. And interestingly, just with Corbyn interestingly always hated the EU because he saw it as a vehicle for the capitalist class and financial elites to exploit the poor. He was on record of doing that for a long time. It's just that there's very strong members of the party who are neoliberal types, internationalists, who have, ever since he got into leadership, have gradually scraped back some power and really changed what he would want to. He would really have wanted to campaign to leave, but he just didn't feel like he could have done, and that's why he's done that.
Okay. Now, right, Ruminations, of course, we've had a discussion about populism and the Trump election in the United States. So why don't you give us your thoughts about the similarities between what has gone on in the UK just over the past couple of months and the Donald Trump insurgency in 3 years ago?
Well, I think that one of the common similarities is a kind of tangled new language as to how the establishment or the left or what have you talk about democracy. Because on the one hand, they like to talk about the subversion of democracy with Trump and the fact that he was elected by not by a popular vote, but by the electoral college. And by the same token, they also want to claim that this tendency towards direct democracy advocated by Nigel Farage and the whole idea of referenda and such is out of touch with the kind of elite intentions of elder British statesmen. So I guess that that the New York Times and the Guardian are now like Burkean conservatives or something, decrying the excesses of direct democracy, which is never what James Madison intended. And I've actually heard them kind of take on this almost sort of Russell Kirk type language. But at the same time, apparently Trump's election was a subversion of democracy because he got elected by the electoral college. So there's a kind of shameless cognitive dissonance that's going on in terms of the rhetoric that they use, where they want to say that we're suffering simultaneously from an excess of democracy, but also subverting democracy at the same time with the rise of populism. And I think that, well, that's silly enough on its own terms, but one of the reasons I think it especially is not flying as well as they assumed it would is largely because of the ground that the left has already paved. And by that, I mean, at one time, the left did have a kind of populist orientation. You had things like the free speech movement at Berkeley. You had the whole anti-Vietnam war phenomenon. And it was kind of like the Monty Python era of the left, which had its own condescensions, granted. But I think that because that took place in an era of mass consumer media, it did a good job of basically indoctrinating people with a kind of libertarian or populist psychology. And now that they have taken control, they are trying to act as if they had never made those advances into the culture, as if they had never basically endowed the public with a kind of populist suspicion of authority. So in a sense, the left is kind of struggling against the fruits of its own legacy now that they no longer want to take on the mantle of liberal revolutionaries. They are finding it difficult to keep power precisely because of the psychology that they help to bring about. And so to an extent, that helps to explain the lack of self-awareness, I think. Because they, more so than other elites in the past, have not really had to deal with this kind of paradigm of mass media and the free speech movement and that kind of thing. But at the same time, it can be extremely baffling how stupidly they can act. For people who want to suppress their opponents so badly, it seems a lot of the time like they're doing the opposite of trying. And I have an example of this, is that there was a sort of panel of supposedly true conservative Republicans when Trump was running, who were basically putting forward the talking point that Trump is not a true conservative, because he's not standing by the six canons of conservatism outlined by Russell Kirk. I guess unlike the people working at Fox News or something, and you shouldn't vote for him because he's not a real conservative. And of course, in the wake of that, he went up in the polls because only the people who preach that kind of thing would have the lack of social awareness, perhaps, to think that anyone would be convinced by that. And I think largely because of this reorientation of the left as the elite entrenched interest and the reaction on the right against that Steve Bannon has a point. That not necessarily for better, but for better or for worse, I really do think that the politics of the coming decades will likely be more in the vein of populism versus elitism, or nationalism versus globalism, more so than the sort of paradigm of Barack Obama versus Mitt Romney or that kind of thing, which I think that people care less about. And the left is very, very complicit in this game. A good example of this would be Noam Chomsky, who's always presented himself as this kind of maverick, like the one person who will support freedom of speech, who I guess is now a Bernie Sanders supporter who wants troops in Syria and seems and takes people like it just, from everything that I've heard, I saw an interview recently with Chomsky where he basically claimed that universities were run by the right wing and that the left had no foothold in universities. So it seems to me like the Chomsky is kind of like a case study in someone who went from being a sort of university, like, hippie professor maverick type, to basically being someone who's willing to validate the New York Times. And I think that's very emblematic of this very, very, very tangible, very pungent paradigm shift that's going on. A final thought for this round would be that, to personalize it more, I think that when I was in high school, for example, I had views not all that dissimilar to the ones that I have now. But at the same time, a lot of the motivation for that was simply that I was being contrarian, and that they were presenting themselves as the smart, open-minded, reasonable people, and I sort of wanted to put my thumb in their eye, proverbially. But of course, all the normal people supported the left because they seemed normal. They seemed to sort of talk in quiet tones or something. But now all of those normal people who maybe found, second wave feminism, or maybe found the New York Times or whatever relatively palatable, are just looking at the new orientation and thinking, well, these people are crazy. Whereas I think that by contrast, the populist right, because it's taken on some of the individualistic or deviant trappings of the left, is more appealing to, you might say, the vulgarity and compliancy of the ordinary person, such that when they look at Boris Johnson or Nigel Farage, there might be some serious question as to whether or not they've actually gone their entire lives weedless, so to speak.
Yeah. No, there's another aspect to this, which is related to a prediction that you made, Keith Preston, on Attack the System. You predicted before the Trump election that the neocons would reorient towards the Democratic Party, and that the conservatives parties would reorient towards a kind of populist working class support. And we've seen this within the past 5 years, not just in England and the United States, but also Bolsonaro in Brazil. We've seen murmurings of it in France and Germany now. They haven't won any electoral success yet, but if Brazil, the United States, and England are precedents, that's probably not unlikely. And also, there's this concept of subversion that even the old left, like you have old left friends, Keith, that will often use rather colorful language to describe what they think of the new left and how it's abandoned classic socialist working class values. And one of the things is that these people who are masters of subversion, they were, Yuri Bezmenov talks about how the Soviets were subverting Western institutions, were themselves subverted by capitalism. And it was almost like they got blindsided and didn't even know it. And now, for example, Bernie Sanders said that open borders was a Koch brothers conspiracy because it just, depressed wages and depressed labor bargaining power. Now he's coming out in favor of all these immigration policies, which he admitted were Koch brother conspiracy. So I guess what I'm asking at is one, how do you explain your prediction and why I think why it's so relevant to the current political shifts, and then also your thoughts on why you think the left was so open to being subverted by global capital interests, even though they were kind of the masters of subversion in other areas?
Well, as far as the shift of the right in the Western world towards a kind of populist nationalism, I first started noticing that probably about 20 years ago, around the time that the anti-globalization movement started to develop. Some of you may recall the Battle of Seattle that took place in 1999. So 20 years ago, there was a mass demonstration in Seattle, Washington, in the United States, and it was a left-wing demonstration against the World Trade Organization. And it was really the beginning of I don't know if it's the beginning, but it was really one of the major moments in the anti-globalization movement. And I remember when it happened, there were commentators saying, wow, this is like something out of the 60s, with riots and clashes with the police and things like that. But one thing that I noticed, though, during that time was that a lot of people on the far right were expressing sympathy for the anti-globalization movement, including, for example, people like Pat Buchanan, the paleocon here in the United States, and others with similar views, some further to the right. And then over the next few years, after that, I started to notice that as well, that the anti-globalization movement was going strong for a while. Every time the World Bank or WTO or IMF or one of these groups would meet, there would be a left-wing riot at their meeting or whatever, just like there is now at an alt-right gathering or something. But I would notice that a lot of people from the right would express sympathy for the anti-globalization movement here and in Europe, and in Eastern Europe and Russia and places like that as well. And that got me thinking that over time, as globalization became more deeply entrenched in globalism or internationalism or what you want to call it, became more and more the status quo, that the right would probably make a shift towards a more nationalist perspective of wanting to preserve the sovereignty and independence of traditional nation states rather than cede that sovereignty to transnational institutions, whether it's multinational governmental federations or trade blocs or the UN or military confederations or transnational corporations or any of those kinds of things, or financial organizations. I thought that back then, this was in the late 90s, early 2000s, that the right would sort of or sectors of the right at least, would reinvent themselves as this kind of nationalist populism against this kind of elitist, globalist internationalism. And interestingly, though, during that same period, I started to notice that the left was becoming less interested. A lot of the left was becoming less interested in opposing the traditional elites and things like that, or the capitalist elites, and adopting a lot of the cultural flavor of the cosmopolitan, urban, middle class, what we now call the woke culture. They didn't call it back then, but it's the same kind of thing. I started to notice, for example, that a lot of the left, even a lot of the hard left, was more interested in, for example, open borders and gay rights and the transgender movement and that kind of stuff, rather than working class interest or class struggle or any of these kinds of things. And over time, both of these tendencies have become more and more pronounced, culminating in their becoming mainstream. We saw that in America in 2016 with the Trump election. This kind of Trump, who positions himself as this populist, nationalist outsider running against elites, versus this candidate, Hillary Clinton, who symbolizes the neoliberal establishment, but running as a woke candidate who's denouncing deplorables and talking about inclusivity and all of this kind of stuff. That paradigm finally became mainstream at that point, and it seems to have done the same thing in the latest English election, at least more or less. And I've seen this happen in other countries as well. I mean, a good example is France, where Macron represents that same kind of neoliberal, internationalist, woke culture, whatever it is. And whereas someone like Marine Le Pen, if you're really an old leftist, in fact, I know old hardcore Marxist-Leninist leaning leftists who actually have a favorable view of Marine Le Pen, because they say, well, look, she's anti-NATO, she's anti-EU, she's anti-EU, she's anti-NATO, she's anti-American, she's anti-globalization, she's anti all these other things. Those would have been considered standard left positions a generation ago. So we see that kind of thing becoming more and more commonplace as well. Now, as to why the left has abandoned its original working class orientation, I think actually that the people that are commonly labeled as the cultural Marxists were actually right about that, in the sense that the narrative that much of the right spins is that, well, okay, you had the old left, the Marxist leaning left, that was all about socialism and working class and that kind of stuff. And then that changes. You have people like Antonio Gramsci or the Frankfurt School who say, well, they know before we can really win the class struggle, we've got to win the cultural struggle, or we've got to achieve intellectual hegemony and things like that. And then in the 50s and 60s, you had people like, for example, Herbert Marcuse from the Frankfurt School, and Horkheimer and some of these other thinkers argued specifically that the working class in developed countries had been bought off by capitalism. They would say, well, look, under capitalism in the developed countries now, if you're working class, you can live like the upper middle class. You can live like an upper middle class like never before. You can have a washing machine and 2 cars and a suburban house. And why is the working class going to overthrow capitalism when they've got, television and all these kinds of things, to all these, consumer goods and recreational items, and, they're not starving and things like that. And that, I think they were actually right in that analysis. The working class is not going to be very interested in class struggle, when they're living in the suburbs and have washing machines and televisions and mobile phones nowadays and all that kind of stuff. And then out of that came another theory that the Maoists developed called the labor aristocracy. And the idea was, well, the working class is stratified on an international level, and you have the labor aristocracy in the developed countries that are actually a privileged working class, and they're the ones they're actually part of the system of exploitation because they're involved in the first world exploitation of the third world or the developing world. That was the standard Maoist line that developed, I guess, in the 60s. And so, of course, the working class doesn't want to revolt against against capitalism because they're part of it. They're bought off by it or whatever. All right. Now, wherever you are on the political spectrum, I think this analysis is actually correct. I think that you did see a decline in class-based politics in developed countries in the mid to late 20th century because the working class did have a pretty good position compared to working classes and poor people around the world, certainly. And I think that the left started looking for other groups that they could cultivate as constituencies. In fact, a lot of them said that, like Abbie Hoffman, for example, who was a leader in the anti-Vietnam War movement, said that. He said, look, we knew that we weren't going to get labor unions to come out and protest the war in Vietnam. A lot of those were traditional working class, patriotic types. Some of them were World War II veterans. We knew that we weren't going to get that. So we went for students and the counterculture and hippies and all these more marginal groups that had a more anti-establishmentarian stance at that point. But what happened along the way, I think, is that the left became completely absorbed by this, at least in developed countries. The political left went from being a movement that was pro-working class or based in working class interests, at least ostensibly, and less about labor unions, and less about the welfare state, less about nationalization of the means of production or whatever, and more about cultural politics. That is, ethnic integration, feminism, gay liberation, as well as social issues on a wider sense, environmentalism and animal rights and concern for the disabled and all these other kinds of things. All that kind of stuff became the focus of the left. Not only that, but the left, this cultural left, started to view the working class, the traditional working class, as the enemy. I think that's particularly true in the United States because it got to be where the traditional working class was viewed as racist and complicit in sexism and homophobia, and a lot of leftists, woke, we now call woke leftists, were thinking, we don't want anything to do with those southern white working class people, those racist redneck scumbags, and these white ethnics in New York City, these Irish and Italian union members who don't want black people living in their neighborhood, or don't like immigrants, or don't like homosexuals, or have sexist attitudes. And, their attitude towards gender roles is, woman, get me another beer from the refrigerator. We don't want anything to do with them. So the left essentially reinvented itself as a party of the woke culture. It's no longer the working class, it's the woke culture. But the woke culture, interestingly, tends to be more heavily concentrated, not exclusively, but more heavily concentrated in this kind of urban, professional, cosmopolitan, upper middle class that in many ways has opposite interests from the traditional working class. It tends to be more conservative on economic policy. These are upwardly mobile people, professional people. They don't want to pay taxes. Some of them are business owners. They don't necessarily like business regulation. At the same time, they're all for the cosmopolitan cultural environment. They don't want to discriminate against any minorities, for example. They want to sell products to them and hire them, and they like immigration because they like all these different ethnically flavored restaurants and that kind of stuff, or some of their best friends are gay artists and all this kind of stuff. So that I think is really the source of the change. I think that that's why this kind of change has taken place, where the left has become not the working class party, but the woke culture party. And ironically, that's had the effect of pushing much of the more conventional working class to the right. And the right has been able to seize on that. The right, I think, has been better, in this era of globalization and mega capitalism, all this kind of stuff that's going on now. That since the resistance to that has emerged, the right has actually been better at positioning itself as, hey, we're the people's party, we're of the people, we're for the working class. Whether that's sincere or not is a separate question. But certainly the right has been better at abandoning a lot of the old, Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, neoliberal rhetoric that says, hey, if you don't want to be poor, get a job. That they've been able to abandon that to a greater degree. and at the same time present themselves as the party of the people on a cultural sense. Like, no, we don't necessarily want your neighborhood to be entirely overrun by immigrants, or we don't necessarily want to make your kids use the same bathroom as transgender people, or whatever. Whereas all that is left for the left to do is be the party of this woke culture and dig themselves deeper into that, by denouncing the other side as, oh, these are deplorables, or these are horrible racists and xenophobes, and don't vote for them. I mean, don't vote for Brexit because that's xenophobic. And that's just not a sellable product.
Yeah. Now Swithun, as an anarcho-capitalist libertarian living in the UK, seeing the sort of left become the bourgeoisie party has got to be ironic. Do you have any explanations or thoughts on that?
To some extent. I mean, just a bit of history in the UK position. You kind of had the old left go into the election of 1983, when you had a guy called Michael Foot, who ran on sort of renationalisation and hard sort of old socialist manifesto, who then was crushed by Thatcher in 83, primarily, I think, because Thatcher won the Falklands War, which kind of came at a opportune time, considering her early economic policies were not particularly popular. And then then the left sort of moved to some extent more culturally left, although obviously not as far as they did now. And they became sort of the managerial class under, say, Tony Blair. But really with Tony Blair, he didn't really offer anything sort of radically different from what has really been established under John Major. It was just rather that he was a new face, and there was lots of corruption scandals with the Tory government of the early 90s and late 90s, which was probably the primary reason why he won. And he was very optimistic. Things can only get better, and he was going to spend more money. So he was a bit more. So the left in the Labour Party really became stronger sort of welfare state capitalists than the 1980s left. So it was really an argument as to how big should the welfare state be, how much spending should take place. And that was really the debate between sort of the Tories and the Labour Party in sort of like the late 90s, early 2000s. But at the same time, Blair does engage in lots of cultural revolution, particularly constitutionally. And he kind of just goes around trying to invite Eastern European migrants to come and live in the UK, primarily for a voting bloc for the Labour Party. As an aside, with this election, Labour did very well in London. But if you look at the demographics of London, this is in the 2011 census, just under 44% of London is white British. And that's even if you include the Irish as well. And the foreign-born number was about 30%. And that's almost certainly gone in the other direction as well. So London is a very, very odd mix. You have some probably similar to some American cities. You have lots of relatively poor immigrants who live there, either first or second generation, or even third, and some highly, highly affluent areas. I think there was a stat I read recently that the welfare bill of London is greater than the UK defence budget. That's how sort of expensive the Greater London is. So potted history, Blair comes in, and then that sort of continued after he leaves. But a lot of the sort of more wokey stuff actually takes place with David Cameron and the Conservative Party, who considered himself the heir to Blair. He was the guy who brought in gay marriage in England. It wasn't the Blairites. Of course, they would have done it, probably, given the right conditions. But they were very much... What Blair instituted was really an attack on the traditional British institutions and to consolidate the right people in the right areas to sort of change the face of Britain from what it had been historically. So, yeah, whether or not you think the left has been bought off by the neoliberals is possibly true. To what extent they're sort of just opportunist leaders, which is probably the case, or whether they generally think in a Gramscian sense that if we can undermine society with immigration and further from atomize family units and divorce, etc., would they be able to sort of increase state power? And of course, if you take Anthony Sutton's thesis that the left has always been on Western capitalist money, even from the Russian Revolution, I mean, it isn't really a huge change. But when it comes to the Labour Party in the UK, they have a big choice to make now: is do they double down on the wokeness and the upper middle class vote, or do they try to go back to traditional working class vote? Keith mentioned how they generally sneer at the traditional working class. One Labour MP claimed that Emily Thornberry, who has previous history to this, said that at least my constituents aren't stupid, in reference to hers, who had a traditional Labour working class area. She'd also criticised some council house with England flags outside historically, saying how racist they were. And this is what happens. I think this is one of the facts with the media who didn't predict the Tory win, is there's a huge metropolitan bubble when it comes to the media. And basically, you get on people you know who are like you, who have the trendy upper middle class values, and that's sort of projected onto the nation, which I simply don't think is nearly as popular. I mean, if you look at if you use Brexit as a weather vane for more traditional, culturally conservative views versus wokeness, which it broadly is. I mean, it does correlate very, very strongly with these sort of views. I mean, if you look at England, I mean, Scotland's a separate case, which I'll mention in a second. If you exclude London, the Brexit vote in England would have been, I'd have to do the maths, but it probably would have been something like 55, 56% to leave. I mean, even with London, it was 53%. That's the overall vote was 52, 48, or slightly under 50, 52, because London was overwhelming Remain. It was like 70%. And if you look at, and Keith's right, if you look at the areas that vote Remain, they're mainly the more metropolitan, higher population cities, typically associated with university towns as well, where the university is a very, very large proportional employer and has great student influence. So the Labour Party has a decision to make. A lot of the old unionist types are saying, well, basically, we need to just go on pro-Brexit, nationalisation, but get rid of the cultural stuff, and we can beat the Tories. And so really what you're going to go to then is a similar situation you had in the 90s, except more economically leftward. With
Right, Ruminations, now that you're back with us, do you have any thoughts to add on the current conversation?
Well, I do. With respect to the left largely putting aside the traditional economic doctrines, and I think embracing something which is more of a cultural leftism, but which nevertheless does still desire to integrate or preserve aspects of the welfare state in order to maintain that particular kind of social control. But at the same time, maybe trying to maintain the facade of the traditional economically working class left. A decent example of this would be someone like Pope Francis. And the reason I bring up Francis is because when he first came in, I think he was trying to present himself as the sort of South American, old style, like labor union Catholic, sort of appealing person who was maybe railing against the Protestant capitalist nation states and that kind of thing. But it turns out, in terms of his public relations, he's very much in with like traveling on jet planes and cooperating with, like, talking to people like Barack Obama and taking on the whole language of political correctness and modern consumer culture. So in other words, he kind of was elected as Pope with this message of, well, it's time to get back to a more holistic or pre-capitalist sort of message. But then he's going around taking selfies with people, and I think that's almost kind of like a personification of the spirit of the contemporary left. I do think it shouldn't go without emphasizing that they do take the welfare state very important. So they may not be socialists in the traditional sense, but they're not just willing to let economic considerations go by the wayside. That is, they do have a very specific vision of, I think, kind of like welfare state corporate capitalism, which is meant to be the economics of the particular social structure that they desire. Right? You couldn't just have corporations running around doing whatever they wanted, or small startups that maybe didn't have, sufficiently large HR departments or what have you. And I think that all of this, tracing back to what Keith was talking about with the Frankfurt School and, well, capitalism or communism wasn't going to work the way they thought it did, so they had to sort of modify it. I mean, I think this may not really be in control of any particular group of people as much as it might appear to be. I think it's more like different people responding, sort of struggling to respond to unprecedented circumstances. So that is, if you have situations that I think, like Josef Schumpeter said, that when you have a kind of prosperous capitalist society, it inevitably leads to a socialist intelligentsia. But then what happens when that socialist intelligentsia finds that the working class doesn't support them well? Then it will become a capitalist socialist hybrid, socialist intelligentsia who are fueled by the benefits of capitalism. So I'm not, and I think this might be the reason why these people are willing to come across as silly, or is why they can't help themselves, is because they're not really as in control as I think a lot of people on the dissident right might like to view them as being. I think that what you're dealing with are competing responses to modernity that are not really a fully coordinated effort. So getting back to somebody like Francis, the reason that he's not going to come out and advocate direct socialism or condemn capitalism wholesale is because he's a world leader now. Right, he is somebody who's basically, he thinks in terms of the UN and internationalism, and it really is just a kind of sociological response to which then ideologies are tailored. I think that final word on this might be that what Schumpeter failed to foresee was that the socialist intelligentsia that is inevitably created by capitalism is one that probably would never actually succeed as a socialist revolt, because then it would be undermining the foundations of its own success. So it's not at all surprising that the left has taken on this kind of quasi-capitalist, a culturally left hybrid. Looking back on it, it almost seems like an inevitability.
All right, we're nearing the end of the hour, so I'll begin the final statements. I'll start with you, Keith. Why don't you give us your final statements?
Well, I think what's interesting is to look into the future and try to predict where all this might be going, this political realignment we've seen in more recent times. One thing that I would point out is that when we see the kind of polarization that exists in the United States today, and it seems like a similar polarization is developing in other places with the Yellow Vest uprising in France and with the things that have happened in England with the latest election and so forth. I tend to look at it like these kinds of things still only really are important to a fairly small number of people. In more recent times, I've become interested in trying to gauge, well, what do people off the street really think about all this stuff? And of course, in the United States, we have to look at the fact that the only election in which the majority votes is the presidential elections. And even there, only by about 50%, about half. The majority doesn't even vote in any of the other elections. Of people who do vote, we have to consider a lot of them vote on the basis of very superficial things like the appearance of a particular candidate or how well they speak or whether they like their name or whether they're physically attractive and things like that. Also, most research that I've seen done on partisanship in the United States shows that even of people who take politics more seriously, the majority of people are not on the far right or far left or hardcore conservatives or hardcore liberals or lefts people. Instead, most people belong to a category that's been called the exhausted majority, which is somewhere in the middle between all of those. They're not necessarily people who like the status quo. They're not necessarily people who say, Joe Biden, that's the guy we got to have. He's going to bring everything back to normalcy. But they don't care for extremism. I know a lot of the left in the United States is always saying, well, surveys show that most Americans actually agree with us on policy. All right, that's true when it comes to things like some modest social democratic things like universal health care or assistance for college students and modest immigration reform. It's not true for totally opening the borders and critical race theory and intersectionality and free health care for illegal immigrants and all of these kinds of things. And I've also seen people from the right say that. I've seen people say, well, the polls show that a third of Americans or 40% of Americans identify as conservative. That may be true, too, in the sense that they prefer lower taxes or perhaps in the United States if they like guns and they're pro-Second Amendment or something like that. But it doesn't mean that they live and die by Fox News and the Rush Limbaugh show and all those kinds of things. So what I think is particularly interesting is the way that this largely, and this is something I started noticing way back in the late 2000s, like roughly the time of the first Obama election. I started noticing that a lot of this comes down to a conflict between the different sectors of the upper middle class. I started to notice that if you really look at the culture wars in the United States, it's really rival factions of what we would consider the upper middle class in terms of you have a more urban, cosmopolitan, blue state upper middle class that's into the wokeness and is rooted in the professional culture and the tech industry and that kind of stuff. And then you have a more traditional upper middle class that's more of your accountants and white collar workers and business types and more traditional types who are the other faction of the upper middle class. And that seems to be really why this is playing out. And the number of people who actually take this that seriously is actually fairly minimal. It's compared to the entire population. I think the PC crowd, for example, seems to be fairly small in number, but they're a lot more. They seem to be a lot larger than they are because they're concentrated in places where they have a big microphone. They're concentrated in the ideas industry, like journalism and media and entertainment and education and human resources and marketing and public relations and all these different kinds of fields where they have a microphone, but numerically they're actually fairly small.
All right, Swithun, what are your final thoughts?
Following Keith's statement about the numbers of the sort of PC woke brigade, I think this is possibly what Labour have to decide. I mean, if they do go down the ultra woke urban middle class vote, I simply don't see them doing very well. There simply is not a large enough constituency. I think most people, the exhausted middle, are just jaded with politics and just think that nothing will alter. They don't believe what anybody says. They just want things to improve. They don't necessarily know how, but they just want what they would see as sensible policy. They're not ideological in any particular way. But it might just be the fact that because the exhausted middle are so jaded that it would be interesting to see if they've looked at the proportion of the turnouts of these certain groups, because it's probably the case these days with turnouts being relatively lower that you do target the extremes because those are the ones who have the proportionally greatest turnout, and so those are the ones who can actually flip seats for you. That might not be true, I don't know, but that's if you're taking a pure numbers game, that is a potential issue. One more thing on the woke thing, which is slightly different, is in Scotland in the recent election, the SNP, the Scottish National Party, kind of swept the board. Someone commented that if you look at the voting proportions in Britain, it looks like Maggie Simpson in the distribution with the SNP in yellow. But the SNP are really weird because and Scottish National Party also love the EU. They're one of these bizarre nationalist groups who have positioned themselves as sort of a social democrat, sort of PC group, but are nationalists at the same time. So they're sort of an odd mix and don't really fit in massively here. So they would be an interesting one to maybe discuss that sort of thing in the future. But I think if the Labour, at least in the UK context, if the Labour Party does go down the woke PC angle, they are simply not going to be in power for a very long time at all.
All right, Ruminations, you get the last word of all.
Okay, well, I think that in terms of what's going to happen with this struggle between populism and the current hegemony, I think that one problem is that people can actually take a lot more abuse than I think a lot of more optimistic dissidents may think. So that is the Soviet Union lasted a fair amount of time, and during much of its existence, its behavior was very bad. And that was not because they were distracted. But a subscriber of mine has said that's not because they were distracted by cell phone pornography, which they didn't have. So in other words, it's not an inevitability that the bizarre behavior of the left will necessarily produce a very speedy, contrary revolt. And another reason that we might have cause to doubt the speed with which the reaction will take place effectively is because, once again, being in a society that identifies as democratic, I think that people like the Hoppians have recognized, are less likely to revolt against a state with which they themselves identify. And I think that's one of the reasons that communist societies may have lasted as long as they did, was because they had this rhetoric of democracy, which previous societies given to analogous abuses did not have recourse to. In terms of the polarization of the discussion, I think that it's interesting that on the one hand, there is this tribalism that's been identified, but it is...
We seem to have lost Ruminations. We'll give him a few seconds, and if we lose him, we'll just we'll let it go, I guess. But I guess I'll give my final thoughts while we're waiting for Ruminations to come back. I mean, it basically looks like that the left has basically transitioned, the political left has transitioned into a movement that doesn't just dislike the current status quo in the countries they live in and envision a different and better future. They hate the countries they live in and are actively seeking to destroy them. In a lot of ways, what we're going through now reminds me of C.S. Lewis's The Last Battle, the final book of the Chronicles of Narnia. You end up having corrupt talking animals teaming up with the Calormans to dupe the good Narnians into just doing behavior that's completely self-destructive and is calculated to enslave and destroy them. And yeah, it's a children's book, and yeah, it was written 70 years ago, but those themes still seem to resonate today. Looks like are you back, right, Ruminations?
I am.
Okay, so yeah, go ahead.
Finish that up. Yeah, I was going to say it's a funny kind of polarization that's going on, because at the same time, I think the conversation has, in certain quarters, become more nuanced. That is, you have people who are willing to say, take up an anti-war line on the right, or are willing to entertain certain competitive ideas that seem to be jumbling of ideas, even as people with ideas that are too different become more agitated towards one another. So yeah, I do see the growth of polarization, but I also see the growth of a certain kind of ill-formedness or nuance of a sort, which I suppose is something. So in closing, yes, things could get a lot worse, but they probably won't have to get that much worse before there is some kind of, or before the the populist revolt or some kind of dissident revolt becomes successful. And the reason for that is largely because, as I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, the footwork that the left has done in advancing populism and with the free speech movement and that kind of thing, and the mass media, I think has kind of made people less receptive to political abuse long term as they would have been in the past. The final thing I'll say is that I think the biggest worry, the biggest concern from my point of view, is that the left might behave so unpalatably that it might drive the right into complacency. So if you take Trump's re-election, for example, I predict that Trump will be re-elected, but the problem is that the bizarre behavior of the Democratic opposition will essentially lead to an uncompetitive Trump. That is, a Trump who doesn't think that he actually has to really appeal to anyone's interests, precisely because the erratic behavior of the opposition is so unpalatable as to drive the reactionary forces into an undesirable complacency.
Well, thanks again, Keith Preston, Swithun Dobson, and Ruminations. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast signing off.